Actually, that's a good idea. I was going to read it, but I forgot to do it before we sing. I was thinking after, but it will be better before. So I'll read the translation first, best for the mood of the singing. So it's 9 verses, and the last, or the 10th verse is an extra verse that was added actually in the time of Prabhupada by his disciples, that specifically glorifies not just Bhaktisiddhanta as the servant of the whole parampara, but specifically his great disciple Srila Prabhupada. So yeah, the first 9 verses are written by Bhaktisiddhanta, and the last verse is written by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. So I'll start with the first verse. In the beginning of creation, the science of devotional service was received by the four-headed Brahma from the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna. Devarshi Narada's understanding of this divine science was obtained from Brahma. The great sage Krishna Dvapayana Vyas, who was empowered to compile the Vedic literatures, became a disciple of Devarshi Narada. Sripad Madhvacharya, the founder of Shuddhadvaita school of Vedanta philosophy, calls himself a servant of Krishna, Dvapayana Vyas. And Purna Prajna Tirtha, who is Madhava, is the guru and sole refuge of Padmanabha Tirtha. The two other principal disciples of Madhava are Nrihari Tirtha and Madhava Tirtha. Madhava Tirtha accepted the great Paramahamsa Akshobhya Tirtha as a disciple. The principal disciple of Akshobhya Tirtha was known as Jaya Tirtha. Jaya Tirtha's service was for his disciple Gyanasindhu. Dayanidhi received the science of devotional service from Gyanasindhu, and the servant of Dayanidhi was Vidyanidhi. Rajendra Tirtha became disciple of Vidyadiraj Tirtha. Rajendra Tirtha's servant was known as Jayadharma or Vijay Dvaja Tirtha. In this way, you should properly understand this disciplic succession. The great sannyasi Sri Purushottam Tirtha received his knowledge in the service of his guru, Vijay Dvaj Tirtha. The principal disciple of Purushottam Tirtha was Subramanya Tirtha. His servant was the great Vyasa Tirtha. Vyasa Tirtha's servant was Lakshmipati Tirtha, whose disciple was Madhavendra Puri Goswami. The chief disciple of Madhavendra Puri was Ishvara Puri, and two of his other disciples were the renowned incarnations of Godhead, Sri Nityananda and Advaita Acharya. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the spiritual preceptor of all the worlds, made Ishvara Puri greatly fortunate by accepting him as his spiritual master. Mahaprabhu Sri Chaitanya is none different from Sri Sri Radha and Krishna, and is the very life of those Vaishnavas who follow Sri Rupa Goswami. Sri Sarup Damodar Goswami, Rupa Goswami, and Sanatan Goswami were the givers of great happiness to Vishwambar, Lord Chaitanya. The great souls Jiva Goswami and Raghunath Das Goswami became very dear to Rupa Goswami. Jiva Goswami was a disciple of Rupa Goswami, and Raghunath Das Goswami, a disciple of Advaita Acharya's disciple, Yadunandan Acharya, was accepted by Rupa and Sanatan as their third brother. Raghunath Das Goswami's beloved student was Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. Krishnadas Kaviraj was an intimate friend of Lokanath Goswami. They lived together in Vrindavan and always discussed the topics of Krishna with one another. Lokanath Goswami, a disciple of Gadadhar Pandit, had only one disciple whose name was Narottama Das. Narottam Das was always engaged in the service of his guru, and he also engaged himself in the service of his guru's intimate friend. Thus he became very dear to Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. To serve the feet of Narottam Das Thakur was the only desire of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who was the fourth Acharya in the disciplic succession from Narottama Das. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur was the Shiksha Guru of Baladev Vidyabhushan, to whom he taught the precepts of Srimad Bhagavatam. Jagannath Das Babaji was a very prominent Acharya after Sri Baladev Vidyabhushan and was the beloved Shiksha Guru of Sri Bhakti Vinod Thakur. Bhakti Vinod Thakur's intimate friend and associate was the eminent Mahabhagavat Sri Gorkishore Das Babaji, whose sole joy was found in Hari Bhajan. These great saintly Vaishnava Paramamsas are devotees of the highest order, and they are all part of Lord Gauranga's own spiritual family. Their lotus feet are my refuge. I have no real interest in devotional service, and I am a poor and lowly Tridandi sannyasi named Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And now the extra verse, including Srila Prabhupada. The renowned Sri Varshabhanavi Daita Das is always engaged in the service of his spiritual master, Srila Gaur Kishore Das Babaji. His foremost disciple preacher is Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who has spread the message of Lord Chaitanya throughout the world and is thus a reservoir of mercy and compassion for all fallen souls. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj ki jai. Krishna hoite chaturmukha, hoye Krishna sevan mukha, Brahma hoite naradera mati. Krishna hoite chaturmukha, hoye Krishna sevan mukha, Brahma hoite naradera mati. Krishna hoite chaturmukha, hoye Krishna sevan mukha, Brahma hoite naradera mati. Narada hoite vyas, Madha kohe vyasadasa, Puna pragna padma nabhagati. Narada hoite vyas, Madhva kohe vyasadasa, Puna pragna padma nabhagati. Narada hoite vyasa, Madhva kohe vyasadasa, Una pragna padma nabhagati. Someone wants it. Nrihari Madhava Bamshe Akshobhya Paramahamse Shishya boli angikara kore. Hari Madhava Bamshe Shobhya Paramahamse Shishya boli angikara kore. Nrihari Madhava Bamshe Akshobhya Paramahamse Shishya boli angikara kore. Akshobhyera shishya jaya tirta name parichaya taradasye jnana sindhu tore. Akshobhyera shishya jaya tirtaname parichaya taradasye jnana sindhu tore. Taha hoite daya nidhi tara dasa vidya nidhi Rajendra hoilo taha hoite Tara kinkara jaya dharma name parichaya parampara jano balo mate Jaya dharma dasya kyati Shri Purushottama jati Tahate brahmanyati tasuri Kyati Shri Purushottama jati Tahate brahmanyati tasuri Vyasatirtha tara dasa Lakshmi pati vyasa dasa Taha haite Madhavendra pure Madhavendra Puri Bara Shisha Bara Shri Ishvara Nityananda Shri Advaita Vibhu Ishvara Puri ke danya korilene Shri Chaitanya Jagat Guru Gora Mahaprabhu Mahaprabhu Shri Chaitanya Radha Krishna nahe anya Rupanuga jane Rajivana Anya Rupanuga jane Rajivana Vishwambara Priyankara Shri Swarupa Damodara Shri Goswami Rupa Sanatana Shri Goswami Rupa Sanatana Rupa Priya Mahajan Jiva Raghunatahana Tara Priya Kavi Krishna Dasa Krishna Dasa Priya Bara Narottama Seva Para Jarapada Vishwanatha Asha Vishwanatha Bhakta Sata Baladeva Jagannatha Tara Priya Shri Bhakti Vinoda Mahabhagavata Bara Shri Gora Kishora Bara Hari Bhajanete Jara Moda Ihara Paramahamsa Gorangera Nija Vamsha Tadera Charene Mamagati Paramahamsa Gorangera Nija Vamsa Tadera Charane Mamagati Ami Seba Udasina Namete Tridandi Dina Shri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Ami Seva Udasina Namete Tridandi Dina Shri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Shri Vashabhanavi Bara Sada Sevya Seva Para Tahara Daita Dasanama Tara Pradhan Pracharako Shri Bhakti Vedanta Namo Patita Janete Doyadama Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj. Jaya Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj. Jaya Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj. Jaya Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada. Nitai Gaura Haribo, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo. Jayam Vishnupad Paramamsa Parivrajakascharya Astota Sata Shishimad, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jayam Vishnupad Paramamsa Parivrajakascharya Astota Sata Shishimad, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Mahamotsava Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Hare Krishna. It was easier for me to do the kirtan. Not that easy, but now it will be very difficult. So before I start, I would like to sincerely ask for the blessings of all the assembled Vaishnavas present here, and I imagine maybe some watching online. And specifically, I would like to ask the blessings of our senior devotees, especially our Prabhupada disciples. I think it would be much more appropriate for them to give class today. I really wonder why I'm sitting here. But if it's their desire, then like I earlier said, then it should be my desire to want to please them. So I've accepted this. But right now I'm regretting it a little, but I'll try. So yeah, before I start, I kind of made my class into 3 parts. Let's see how it goes. I'll try as much as possible from the little I know and especially remember. So I did prepare quite a bit in case I go completely blank, I'll read. But I would like to speak on the life of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura a little bit, and then on a few aspects, his personality, message, mission, and contribution. And we can also share. And then he gave 64 principles of community, which I think are relevant for anyone. And obviously we won't be able to discuss all of them, but if we have a bit of time, I would just like to maybe focus on 3 or 4 of them. And then at the end, if we have time, I don't know what the time schedule is today, no one has told me, but then I would like to share something at the end, specifically on Prabhupada and Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj. So just to understand the position of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and our whole Guru Parampara, of course we know they're eternal associates of the Lord, and all of them have their eternal activities in the spiritual world and even at different times in the material universes. But from a historical perspective, for us, we'll put it in that way. So actually I would like to start with 5,000 years ago, when Krishna was manifest on this earth. Obviously he came to re-establish Dharma, but also mainly his pastimes in Vrindavan to relish with his devotees and show us the highest platform of devotional service to the Lord. So his main reason was to actually help us surrender unto him, teach us how to actually accept the message of God, the message of love of God, and ultimately reconnect with what we have lost. But he didn't exactly come in the mood that you would say teaching the devotees, teaching the people how to actually practice devotional service. So this is why he came as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu 500 years ago. We all know there's the external reason and internal reason. External reason is to spread love of Godhead, show how to practice Krishna consciousness on the highest platform and return to the eternal abode of Goloka Vrindavan. But also his internal mood was to obviously experience not just the love received to him, by his devotees, but to experience that love as a devotee, which sometimes is difficult to understand, but apparently even Krishna has difficulty to understand that love, how strong the love of devotee can be for him. So yeah, he came for that reason, but he was very busy with his pastimes. He very much was engaged in sharing Krishna consciousness, but as we know, he only wrote down 8 instructions as the Shikshashtakam, but he obviously had many conversations with his devotees and shared the philosophy, but he never really put it down as much for future generations. And this is why he asked the Goswamis and his dearest associates actually to be able to share this Krishna consciousness with us in a relevant way, because we know, especially in the later years, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was very, very ecstatic, and so it was, even now for devotees, it's hard to understand these moods on a very high level. But the Goswamis obviously put down the Krishna consciousness in a way that it's accessible from the beginner, initiate devotee that's starting his process from the basics very, very much up to the highest platform. So as living entities in the Kali Yuga, it's very difficult for us to understand. So this is why obviously he wanted the Goswamis to give us the whole process from beginning to end, and they wrote so much literature. But then to continue on, what happened after the Goswamis and obviously the associates that continued, Srinivasacharya, Narottam Das Thakur, and who was the last one? Shyamananda Pandit. When they left, there were always Vaishnavas around, that's always there. But when we speak about like a real prominent Vaishnava society practicing on the right level and in the right way, then after they left, there was a whole period, you could say, of covering, of darkness, where specifically Gaudiya Vaishnavism was not so prominent anymore and was also misunderstood. And there was a moment of light somewhere in the middle between when later on Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta Prabhupada came with Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Baladevi Vidyabhushan, and they also wrote down many, many things about Krishna consciousness for the future generations. But then obviously that period of darkness continued all the way up to Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And this is when Bhaktivinoda Thakur obviously realized the miserable condition that Gaudiya Vaishnavism was in. And the few people that seriously practiced Gaudiya Vaishnavism were not very visible. They were very much hidden because Gaudiya Vaishnavism had become actually very much mocked by society, by most of the Vaishnavas, because the general Gaudiya Vaishnavas, and specifically the most prominent one, had actually made a complete mess of the philosophy. And I don't know the technical terms, but I'm sure we've heard them many times. There were many, many groups. I don't know if it was more than 20 or something like that, of different groups with different philosophies. And obviously they were misbehaving in the name of the teachings of Lord Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. And so people were very much disgusted by what Gaudiya Vaishnavism was representing. So this was very painful for Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So we know he established the Siddhanta, the principles. He wrote so many books. He wrote so many bhajans. He was also a very busy person in many ways, and he obviously connected to very great personalities of the time, whether spiritual or even on material level. He was very qualified. And at the time, we know it was the British Raj in India, so there were many, many things happening. And he obviously thought, this is the time now, we need Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mercy to spread. Mahaprabhu wanted it, and the world has never been in such a disturbed state, whether materially or even in terms of spiritual organization. So at the time in 1874, let me look at my notes if I say it correctly. Yes, in 1874, he was living in Jagannath Puri. He was actually the magistrate there, which was an incredible position for an Indian-bodied person to be, because it was ruled by the British empires. And to my memory, there was only 2 or 3 people in the whole of India in that position. It was the highest position you could achieve. And he was in charge of the Jagannath Puri temple at the same time. And just prior to that, he obviously understood that I need to take on the mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and spread it far and wide. So he, like any pure devotee, he felt very insignificant, humbled, and he was thinking, I need some help. So he actually prayed. He prayed if he could receive a ray of Vishnu, if the Lord could send someone that could help him in his mission. And as we know, then in February of 1874, on the 6th of February, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj appeared in this world. So yeah, immediately from his birth, it was understood that he was not an ordinary person. And actually in astrology, it was explained that this person would have a major impact on the world. So yes, they could understand, everyone, whether it was from a spiritual perspective or even from a material perspective, that this was going to be someone very important, very respected. And in that same year, actually, there was the Rath Yatra, about 6 months later, in Puri, and we all know the story that the Jagannath cart stopped in front of the house of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And what was the wife's name of Bhaktivinoda Thakur? A great devotee. Sorry? Bhagavati Devi, yes. She actually brought out Bhaktisiddhanta, and amazingly, obviously because she was the wife of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, she was actually allowed to go on the Jagannath cart, which most of the time we can see nowadays be very difficult to go on the cart for anyone, you know, unless you're a panda or a pujari there. So she was obviously allowed as the wife of a great personality. And she placed little Bimala Prasad, which I forgot to mention. His name was Bimala Prasad because understood that he was actually the one who would give out the mercy of Jagannath. And we know in the Jagannath temple, I won't say the story, but there's the form of Durga Devi as Bimala. And ultimately, after the pastime, actually it was accepted that Jagannath would only give out prasadam to everyone after Bimala Devi had accepted it. So obviously Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was a perfect representative of Lord Jagannath and the distributor of that mercy. And actually I've heard many devotees mention this, that it is not mentioned his name, but in the Padma Purana it is actually explained that in the future the great personality will be born in Puri and will spread the glories of Lord Jagannath all over the world. And we might think this is maybe Prabhupada, but Prabhupada wasn't born in Puri. And obviously he did spread the glories of Lord Jagannath all over the world, but on whose instruction? On the instruction of the servant of Jagannath, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bimala Prasad. So it's amazing that when we read the scriptures, and obviously by the vision of the great devotees that study the scripture, they can connect many things that we might not immediately be able to understand. So yes, what happened, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj was on the cart, and his mother put him at the feet of Lord Jagannath, and amazingly, one of the garlands of Lord Jagannath fell actually on the little child, and they understood that this child is very blessed. They took it as a sign that he's directly blessed by the Lord. So in the same year, a bit later actually, the whole family moved to Calcutta, And in that time, his father actually built what was called a Bhakti Bhavan, so a specific house where they would live and he would do his bhajan. And while digging the foundations, they found a Kurma Shalagram Shila. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was actually from that age. I don't have the exact age. I don't know if it was 7 years old, quite young actually. I think it was around 7 if I remember. He was actually given the responsibility for deity worship, full deity worship. So imagine how qualified he was, a 7-year-old child, to do full deity worship. And he continued that. And at 7, he was also already proofreading the monthly periodical of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, the Sahajana Toshani. So another fact to show the amazing, even if we don't look at it from the spiritual aspect of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, which we know ultimately he's eternal associate, but even from, you could say, material vision, how many people from outside, including ourselves, maybe sometimes we have this tendency to judge, but we could see that he was so greatly qualified for a 7-year-old to be able to proofread the periodical magazine of his father, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who we know is one of the greatest writers in the history. So yes, his father obviously fully trusted him. He knew he wasn't a normal child. And in that same year, there's different records of that. I've heard differently, but either 7, I've heard 10 or 13, but ultimately his father gave him tulsi beads. Apparently, they say it was directly from Puri. And at the same time, he gave him the Harinam mantra and the Nishringa mantra. I haven't done my research. Maybe some devotees would know specific meaning of how you give the Nishringa mantra. We know the Harinam mantra, but I guess in Vaishnavism, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there must also be a specific reason of giving the Nishringa mantra. So then he actually continued general studies in Calcutta as a young boy, and he quickly mastered them. Actually, it was explained that he was a Shrutidara, which often was termed, obviously, for brahmachari studying, because obviously brahmachari means student, was any brahmachari that could remember everything he heard, every word. So actually, Bhaktisiddhanta never ever no one was ever able to ask him something, or if people challenged him, he would never ever hesitate on anything he heard, anything he said. He could repeat every single word as he read it, as he heard it. So you can imagine he had perfect memory. And then later on he went to higher studies, and he specifically studied Sanskrit. And he excelled in Sanskrit, became a perfect, I don't know if it's Sanskritist, I don't know if that's the correct word, and also different types of studies like mathematics and astrology. And because he was the best in all of those aspects, he was actually given the name. I wasn't sure till I heard it yesterday, because I know later on he was called Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, but actually this was like a name that was given like that to him. It isn't mentioned. I didn't see any other mention of, was it the teachers or students, but he was given the name Siddhanta Saraswati, which obviously means one whose knowledge and scholarship is blessed by the goddess of learning. So already at that young age, they understood that he was directly blessed to have this amazing capacity to assimilate and understand everything. So later on in 1887, Bhaktivinoda was moved to Krishnanagar. He was posted there as governor, and he would often visit Navadvip. And on one of these visits, he stayed at the Dharmashala there, and we know he had amazing vision. That night, he was sitting on the balcony, and he looked over the Ganges, and he saw this manifestation of this amazing white temple. And we've all heard the story many times, and this was actually the vision of the Adbhut Mandir, of the place of birth of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And obviously then started his whole revelation of the Dham, the different holy places, and specifically it was also the time where he had Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and then later on Bhaktisiddhanta had to face a lot of challenges with different Gaudiya Vaishnava groups, caste Goswamis, who had a very different opinion about, the actual facts of where Mahaprabhu was born and the Siddhanta. And so he had to do a lot of research, and he proved, according to different papers, different records, that actually the birthplace of Mahaprabhu was not in the town of Navadvip, which we know nowadays on the other side of the Ganga, but actually in the original Navadvip town where he was born, is actually in Mayapur. So specifically that place is in, if I'm correct, in Antardvip. It's actually considered the center of Navadvip. And so he established actually that this was the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and then later revealed many of the different places Mahaprabhu had the pastime. And then he moved to the other side of the Jalangi, obviously still with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura was young, to Godrumadvip, and he established the Swananda Sukhada Kunj, which was a specific place where he actually was using to actually start his, concept of preaching, and specifically meeting with great personalities and great acharyas there. Yes, Bhakti Vinod Thakur. And later on, I'll get to that many things happened there. And he would often visit with his father. They would travel, Godrumadvip, Krishnanagar, and Kolkata for different work his father was doing. So they moved a lot around also. And when Bhaktisiddhanta was 17 years old, in Kolkata, actually, when he was doing his higher studies, he actually created a philosophical discussion group, which was called the August Assembly. And obviously, he really wanted to go deeper into the essence, and found similar classmates that wanted also to participate and go deeper into the study of the philosophy, study of the Vedas. And he made an amazing vow, and had all the others also make that vow. And he made a vow of lifelong celibacy. And I'm sure you've heard this before, and everyone made the same vow, but he was the only one to maintain that vow. So obviously, to understand that it wasn't an easy thing to do. And later on, he actually helped his father a lot in the area of Mayapur, and propagating the Krishna consciousness movement. He would share the teachings of Mahaprabhu. And during that time, actually in 1896, Bhaktivinoda Thakur sent the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu his life and precepts. So this was the first time that actually the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was actually sent overseas, like this, in a direct way, in a form, a book. And it was sent to America, to some universities, and also to London, actually. And Canada, America, yes, so USA, and yes, exactly, USA and Canada. And devotees have actually found many of these copies in more recent times. So it's wonderful to know that before Prabhupada actually went to the West, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was already making his imprint, slowly by slowly. And actually one very wonderful fact is that same year that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came in the form of a book to the West, actually Prabhupada was born. So we now understand this wasn't a coincidence. This was the time that obviously the great personality was going to take on that service and go and spread Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in such an amazing way later on. Then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati traveled quite a bit with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Gaya, Benares, Prayag. He met many great personalities. And then when returning to Godruma Dweep, he met his spiritual master for the first time, Gorkishore Das Babaji. And he obviously had a very great impression of the detachment of Gorkishore Das Babaji, but he didn't think it would be his spiritual master. And actually, during that time, they were in Swananda Sukhada Kunj, and he met a lot of great Vaishnavas, actually the greatest Vaishnavas we know of the time. So there was Jagannath Das Babaji, obviously his father Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Gorkishore Das Babaji, and Vamsi Das Babaji. And he actually spent a lot of time associating with them, hearing from them. So you could see this amazing, wonderful group of devotees, obviously probably discussing the most wonderful pastimes and also how we're going to spread this Krishna conscious movement for the world. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur had already by then predicted that he really wanted to spread Krishna consciousness all over the world, and that it had to be spread. You know, this was not only meant for Bengal, for India, but for everyone in the world. And he specifically wanted his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, to take the next step and help him to take an extra step in doing that. So he obviously requested his son to get initiated by Gorkishore Das Babaji. And yeah, that's a very nice story. Gorkishore Das Babaji obviously didn't want to accept any disciples. He was an absolute, you could say, bhajan, anandi, in the sense that he was actually completely focused in the internal mood of serving Radha and Krishna. And so for him, on that level, we can understand that those devotees obviously don't always have a connection with the world that we can understand. They're very much aloof to it. So most of our preachers, fortunately, they put themselves on that position to be able to connect to the world, come to our level to be able to preach to us. But for some of them, actually, they're already in the transcendental pastimes. But nonetheless, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj insisted, and Gorkishore Maharaj refused a few times. So he went back to his father a few times and told him, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur said, if Gorkishore Das Babaji doesn't initiate you, then your life is useless. So obviously he really wanted him to get initiation. So then Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, I'm sure, was honest in what he said, but at the same time, probably the best way to convince someone, he actually went to Gorkishore Das Babaji and he said, if you don't initiate me, then I will commit suicide. So I think this was a very convincing argument, and obviously Gorkishore Das Babaji understood that actually Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was such a sincere devotee. And this is why he also didn't have disciples and didn't associate with so many people, because he didn't want to be disturbed in his internal devotional service, in his bhajan. So later on in 1902, with his father, he went to Jagannath Puri, actually, and at the time it was quite disturbing. There were many Sahajiya groups there. And so actually him and his father, they were trying to re-establish the proper Siddhanta and the proper understanding of devotional service. And yes, we know many of these Sahajiya groups were completely distorting actually the philosophy of Krishna consciousness by jumping over the process of sadhana bhakti, and they wanted to go to the highest platform, but obviously not being qualified. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati would confront them, he would obviously have debates with them, and he would prove that actually all of this was just done for sense gratification. It wasn't a service to Krishna. It wasn't following the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, of Lord Krishna, and in any way done in the right mood. So it was very disturbing to Bhaktisiddhanta and Saraswati Thakur. And actually then he really started to decide, okay, I need to establish those principles more. And this is when the desire came to re-establish, because we know at the time Varnashram wasn't really established, it was completely lost, it was a caste system, and people were misusing it. So actually he had many discussions with different personalities and shared his thoughts, and specifically he met also with the South Indian priest, the head priest of the Ramanuja Sampradaya, and he actually discussed Tridandi Sannyas. So we know at the time many of the Vaishnavas wouldn't accept sannyas, because sannyas was obviously not considered something that was, how do you say, in terms of the highest platform of Krishna consciousness, was rejected because of how many of the sannyasis would behave. But actually by this discussion with this head priest from the Ramanuja Sampradaya, it was actually understood that through Shastra, that this is actually accepted as part of a Vaishnava Dharma. So it is meant to support Vaishnava Dharma. And so this is when actually Bhaktisiddhanta decided we need to re-establish this. So this is when he started reorganizing the mission, and of course established brahmachari ashrams and so on. But actually before that, in Mayapur, amazingly, he spent 4 years, he made a vow to chant 1 billion names of the Lord. And so he spent 4 years doing that. So this was before he actually really started establishing the Gaudiya Math. And I've heard this through different devotees actually. There's been some research done by our scholars that apparently this same Japamala that was chanted on by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was actually the one that was chanted also by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And he chanted also 1 billion names, he had made the same vow. So amazing to think that on the same Japamala you can imagine the potency that was there of the holy name. And many of you have probably heard when he chanted, he was obviously living in the minimal condition, in a little hut or cottage, and there was even a broken roof. So when it would rain, he would be holding an umbrella. And he didn't want to be bothered for any reason, so he would just be there and chanting. And this is what obviously gave him, you could say, from the level of teaching us the strength to be able to do that. So obviously we cannot emulate that. Can speak for myself, definitely myself, and we understand that we cannot perform this type of bhajan. So we follow the instructions of our acharyas, and they never told us to do this. But it is very significant as an example to show that our individual relationship and with the holy name, and the time we spent with that, as little distracted as possible, especially during those 16 rounds we have to do every day, and more if we can, is key to actually our ability to share Krishna consciousness with others. If we don't have this inner strength, then what do we have to offer? So he was obviously showing that by an example at such a high level that most of us would never be able to emulate. And later on, let me look. Yes, so this is actually, I was hearing a lecture from Radhadesh Maharaj, and he was actually explaining how one time his father was invited to a conference, and it was a conference that was very important for the whole Vaishnava world, because at that time throughout India, actually there was a lot of selfish motivations in the names of religion and high positions in society. And obviously what I was mentioning earlier, this was all based on the caste systems. So the idea of that was actually that a Brahmana that was born in a family was a Brahmana, and not by qualities. So this was a major block in actually spreading Vaishnavism, because Vaishnavism is not for a certain class of people, especially not by birth. It is our right of birth to be Vaishnavas. So actually this was limiting the capacity to actually be able to take up Vaishnavism, to take up also position of becoming a Brahmin, the qualifications of that. And this was a great impediment in spreading Vaishnavism. So actually, yeah, long story short, it's quite a story, but there was a big battle at the conference. And then Bhaktivinoda Thakur was specifically asked to speak. And all the great acharyas depended on him, actually. They understood that he was the most qualified. And actually, he was struggling because he had a very high fever. And the leaders were saying, there's not any other Vaishnav that has in the world who can put down these degraded rascals who are degrading our whole Vedic civilization with their selfish motivations. So because such people were actually called so-called Brahmanas and were supposed to elevate the consciousness of people, but because they themselves weren't practicing obviously by qualities, they weren't able to do it. So actually people were very confused by the Brahmana position, by Vaishnavism. And they were also teaching actually how to, there was actually a kind of exchange. So you pay and I purify your sins, which was obviously not the process of how Brahmanas were supposed to share spiritual knowledge. So anyways, Bhaktivinoda Thakur re-established the way of how to do those things. And then later on, Bhaktisiddhanta went to Midnapur, and at that conference, first the Brahmanas began to speak, and they were explaining, only if you are so fortunate due to the previous births of so many pious activities can you be born in a Brahmana family, and only such a birth can make you glorious and worthy of the spiritual world. What to speak of teaching other Vedas? No one else should touch Vedas. Then the Vaishnavas asked Bhaktisiddhanta to kindly speak. So this time Bhaktisiddhanta obviously was representing all the Vaishnavas. So he went up and took the position. And very intelligently, this was Bhaktisiddhanta. He was the perfect preacher. So he started glorifying the Brahmins. And all of them became very happy. And they were very satisfied and thinking, oh, he's on our side. He's the leader of them, but he's actually on our side. So this was Bhaktisiddhanta's way of getting them attentive. And as he was glorifying the Brahmins, they were becoming more and more pleased. Then he began to explain what a Brahmana is. And then their hearts were broken. Minds, and he established that the Vaishnava is one who surrenders to Krishna. So obviously the famous verses in the Madhya Lila, Yari deka tareka Krishna upadesh, amara gyana guru hana tara edesh, kiba vapra kibanyasi shudra kinenai, ye Krishna tadva veta se guru hai. So where Lord Chaitanya explains whether you are a Shudra or a sannyasi, doesn't matter. If you know the science of Krishna consciousness, you can become the Guru for the whole world. So he explained that everyone had that power just to hear the message sincerely. And if people lived by those principles, then they would actually be qualified Brahmanas and could teach the message of God. And ultimately that this means you're a Vaishnava, so automatically you have the qualifications of a Brahmana. And I'm sorry I'm reading, but my mind has gone quite blank, so I think it's best that I kind of read and I will summarize the end because I see the time is flying. So actually, in 1914, Bhaktivinoda Thakur disappeared from this world at Bhakti Bhavan in Calcutta. And then very soon later, Gaur-Kishore Das Babaji also disappeared from this world. So actually, the whole future of Gaudiya Vaishnavism was left in the hands of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So he obviously had a major task at work. And when Gorkishore Das Babaji actually left his body, everyone understood he was a liberated soul, a great Paramahamsa. So this was actually understood by all the residents. And actually what happened is many of the Babajis in Navadvip wanted to claim his body. Obviously considered it sacred, so what they wanted is to put his body, I guess, where they live in a samadhi and use his body in that way to... and they accepted him at the time as the number one Paramahamsa. And they actually, their main reason for having his samadhi there is not for spiritual reasons, it was because people would come and visit the place, so it was another way of receiving donations. So you could see how even the so-called Babajis, Vaishnavas at the time, it was a very materialistic atmosphere. So actually Bhaktisiddhanta at the time was living across in Mayapur, because I think Gokishore was in Kuryagram. And he was he came over, and there was actually a big debate, and people were fighting over Gorkishore Das's body, and end up even having constables there, police officers there, and they were very scared of how the crowd was actually moving forward. It was becoming almost quite violent. And then Bhaktisiddhanta actually came up and said, I will take this body. And the Babajis said, who is he? You know, he's not a sannyasi, he's not, you know, they didn't respect him. And he said, they obviously said, you're not even a Babaji. And how can you touch the body of another Babaji? Only a Babaji can do that, so we deserve to take his body. And Bhaktisiddhanta actually very emphatically claimed that I'm his only disciple, and I'm the only one amongst you who is following his teachings. So in one phrase, he made it very clear of the position actually of not just himself, but understanding that if you actually want to claim the body of a great devotee like that, you have to be qualified. So none of them were following his teachings. And he said, my Guru Maharaj is absolutely pure, and only someone who is as pure as him can touch him. So famously then he asked actually if any of the Babajis had not had any illicit relations with a woman in a year. Then he said in a month, and then even said in 3 days. And actually the police officers then questioned, okay, this doesn't make sense, how will you prove it, you know? And he said, I will take their word for it. So this was the confidence that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj had. And because they actually were also fearful and understood the position at that time of Bhaktisiddhanta, and they actually all started turning their backs and walked away. But then some people were actually saying, but Gorkishore Das Babaji desired to be pulled along the streets of Navadvip. And obviously we should understand, and Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj just clarifies this, that this was because of his humility, that he didn't consider himself in any highly position. He considered himself as insignificant, but he was actually just trying to teach us a principle. But actually Bhaktisiddhanta declared that the body of his spiritual master is actually fit to be held in the hands of God. So then he quoted Haridas Thakur, that when Haridas Thakur left his body, actually Chaitanya Mahaprabhu personally carried his body. So he said his spiritual master was also such a great devotee. So then obviously they put a beautiful samadhi in Kulyagram, which was then moved to Sridham Mayapur later on when there were floods. And this is at the time when, around the same time, I don't know if it was just before, but this is actually the time when he was giving lectures, and obviously Srila Prabhupada, or sorry, am I getting this mixed up? Oh no, this is when he had his vision actually, that specifically he actually explains his vision of the Panchatattva in his dream, that instructing him to actually he actually, not just Panchadadva and all of the associates, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Janas Babaji, and his spiritual master, Gaurkishore Das Babaji, and they all spoke to him that he needed to go out and preach, and that they were with him, they would never leave him, and that they would empower him and have his blessings, and he would receive all support, and that by this he would actually always feel their presence. So obviously at that time he realized that they were all expecting him to continue the mission they had all come to this world for. And this is when he understood, okay, now I have to fulfill the mission. And it's funny because Prabhupada had quite a similar dream. So then actually it was in 1922, a bit later, that Prabhupada met Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And we all know the story, how he met and then instructed him that you're a very intelligent young man and you should go and preach in English. And so then they continued. And Bhaktisiddhanta obviously was then establishing the Gaudiya Math very strongly and was establishing the pure teachings of Lord Krishna, Lord Chaitanya all over India. And he opened more than 60 mats, if I remember the number says 64 mats. And he established ashrams, temples, he wrote books, he actually took again the Sajjana Toshni of his father and continued the periodical. And he was writing so many articles, meeting so many people, and he was actually really establishing Gaudiya Vaishnavism back to his early splendor that was there the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But obviously he still had a desire, and although in India Krishna consciousness was spreading, he wanted it to spread all over India, that this was not just meant for the Indian people, this was actually the dharma of every single living entity everywhere. And then he instructed specifically Prabhupada a few times on this. And while he was in Bombay, actually Prabhupada wrote a letter to Bhaktisiddhanta when he was very ill. And it was quite obvious that he would have to leave this world. And Prabhupada actually wrote in this letter, it was a longer letter, but he wrote that you have so many amazing disciples, brahmacharis, sannyasis that do personal service for you. But I'm just a grihastha. And Prabhupada mentions actually in that lecture that he gives that, I was helping financially, but I wasn't able, or I felt I couldn't personally serve my spiritual master. He was saying that those brahmacharis and sannyasis are living with him, are so fortunate they can serve him 24 hours a day. But I have so many responsibilities, I can't. But he said, I would like you to instruct me how to serve you. And then this was a few weeks before Bhaktisiddhanta left his body, so this in December of 1936. And he kind of gave him the same instruction he originally gave him in 1922. And he said, please take this message of Lord Chaitanya, the pure message of love of Godhead, and spread it throughout the world in the English language. Actually, in this one it's shortened, but I read actually when Prabhupada mentions it, because this was in the class, in the English, to the English countries in the English language. And one might think, well, why does Bhaktisiddhanta say, if it's to the English people, it would naturally be in English, or you would do, if it's in English, it would be to the English people. But actually you can look at it the other way, that he was actually giving the practical principle that you have to preach to the people in a way that they can not just understand, but according to the culture. So obviously he wouldn't preach in English to people who are from non-English countries. So he was specifically making that distinction that you go to English-speaking countries and preach in English. So it's very important for us to understand also that when we preach to people, we should actually not expect them to try and understand us, but we should actually make the effort to be understandable to them. And this is actually the essence of preaching, that we let people take a step forward from wherever they're at. So then I'm summarizing. Then a couple weeks after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's departure took place, he was in the Bagbazar temple in Calcutta. And actually all the devotees had a beautiful kirtan around him. And he asked to one of his main disciples, Sridhar Rakshak Maharaj, to sing for him the beautiful song of Narottam Das Thakur, Sri Rupa Manjari Pada. So this song was sung actually for him. And then he asked them to sing the Shikshashtakam prayers. So he wanted to hear the, obviously, prayers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And then he actually instructed them specifically, which Prabhupada very similarly instructed his disciples also in his final days, that they must serve one another with love, preach together, and cooperate. And this was very much Prabhupada's mood, always, but specifically at the end he said, your love for me will be shown by how you cooperate with me. And importantly, actually, also Maharaj, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, told them to divide the management into an authority called the GBC, Governing Body Commission. So this was obviously only fulfilled by Srila Prabhupada, because at the time the Gaudiya Math wasn't able to fulfill that promise, but then Srila Prabhupada later on took it. So I did want to share a few more points, but I think time is flying. So I don't know how much time. I wasn't told till when the class can be given. 10 minutes, 5 minutes? Okay. So there was just one or two reflections I wanted to share. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to speak very naturally. It's my first time. And
it's very nice.
yeah, sorry. And I just wanted to share, I couldn't say realization, just meditation. I was thinking on how we're so fortunate, so very fortunate, and sorry to embarrass you one more time, Nikunja Vasini Machi and Jaibhadra Machi, that we have Prabhupada disciples here who are, we have to understand, it is not just a formal thing, disciple. Actually, this means that we're actually children of those great acharyas, we're part of their family. And this always makes me think of Prabhupada in his dedication in the Krishna book. Actually, the first person he thanks is his father, Gaur Mahande, who trained him up, who instructed him how to worship deities, gave him his first Jagannath Ratya cart, learned him how to play Mridanga, and gave him the principles of devotional service. But then Prabhupada mentions that he imbibed them, but then actually these ideas were later solidified by his eternal father, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj. So this is very actually important instruction for us to understand that obviously we have our family, and that's very important, and that relationship should be used in Krishna service. But we should never forget that ultimately our eternal family is on a spiritual basis. So it's amazing that we have grandchildren of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati present with us, and many great-grandchildren, and some great-great-grandchildren. So yeah, like we sang today in the Guru Parampara song, actually this is our eternal family. This is the connection we always have, whether it's in this life, in our next life. And ultimately, we're all established in that eternal relationship through this family lineage. So it's amazing if you look at the Guru Parampara and you realize that these are the greatest devotees of the Lord, and obviously all the way up to the Lord himself, who himself manifests, he himself manifests his time, he manifests himself many times within the Guru Parampara, as originally Krishna, as Vyasadeva, as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Nityananda Prabhu, and so on. So we can see how we're so fortunate that many of personalities present in our family are the greatest associates of the Lord, and at the same time the Lord in different forms and at different times. So we have the greatest family, and we should never forget that. And just wanted to speak a little bit on personality, so of Bhaktisiddhanta, one specific aspect. Many people see him as a very hard preacher. He was called the Simha Guru, the Lion Guru, and he obviously, at the time it was needed, he did disturb many people, but for the benefit of them, because people were misbehaving, people were had a wrong conception of the philosophy, and not just that, they were influencing others. So he had to be very strong, and to understand that actually that was true humility. We might often think humility is being humble and meek, but actually real humility is to be honest about the absolute principles of reality, is to understand our position and ultimately to serve Krishna in that way. So actually he had to do this, and it was later understood by many people who actually criticized him. Later they understood that if it wasn't for Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, actually at the time most of the Gaudiya Vaishnavism would have been very quickly lost. Whatever Bhaktivinoda Thakur had already established in terms of teachings and spreading a little bit and obviously creating a beginning of the mission, but Bhaktisiddhanta was the one who made it grow. And in that short period, for him to spread Krishna consciousness so much around India, he had to be very bold. There was no other way. So we can understand that this was actually done out of humility, just to follow the instructions of his predecessors and obviously of the Lord himself. And one other aspect that was of his mission is that he didn't want to give anything else than devotional service, pure devotional service. So that's why he was very accommodating in many ways. There are many stories, but ultimately he always preached that one should completely surrender to Krishna, that every other path is obviously not the ultimate essence of life. So many times he did try and, very staunchly convince people in debates and confront other philosophical thoughts, but it was just out of love to give them actually what he thought was best for them. So yeah, many of them were very stubborn-headed. So the only way to convince them, especially at the time, it was very much respected, that in argument you could convince someone by stating shastras and philosophical truths. Nowadays it's a little different, but yeah, at the time he was able to do that. And a very important part of his mission was obviously spreading. So his idea was very much spreading. So he, like I said, he established books and magazines, and he was asked actually once why he printed a daily spiritual newspaper, which was actually entitled the Nadya Prakash. And the response of Bhaktisiddhanta was very, very amazing. And he said, if an insignificant city can produce 5 daily newspapers, so he was talking about general newspapers, then why can't we publish a newspaper every second about the eternal, ever-fresh, transcendental activities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his unlimited spiritual planet, Goloka Vrindavan? So we can understand by that there's no end to the glories of the Lord. So to say, why was he publishing every day? What's the use? And he was obviously giving the very obvious reason. And he also predicted actually that while translating or writing, publishing many of the Shastras and Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita and so on, and he predicted at the time that many foreigners would learn Bengali to relish the nectar of the Charitamrita, and just as his father also predicted that one day all of those different foreigners, he mentioned even the countries, I think America, France, maybe Germany, Russia, would come together and chant the holy names of the Lord and come to Mayapur Dham and do devotional service there. So I wanted to say one last aspect on what he offered, his contributions. So he actually also re-established kirtan as an act of worship rather than a theatrical performance, because at the time, like I was speaking about earlier, many of the Sahajiya groups, kirtan was very prominent still, but it was totally misunderstood, and it wasn't meant for the pleasure of the Lord, but for sense enjoyment. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati re-established the reason of kirtan It's to glorify the Lord and try and reestablish that position of servant with the Lord. And he also restored the role of a guru. So at the time, many of the gurus were actually, he used a hard word, but they were like tax collectors. So they would have just a number of disciples, so they could receive money and whatever else, worship in exchange. But he said the only function of a real guru is to give love of God to people, so ultimately teach the higher purpose of life. And he was actually one of the most innovative preachers we have ever known. And he used the principle of Yukta Vairagya to such an extent, which obviously Prabhupada continued later on. So he was actually also the first sannyasi in India who allowed his preachers to preach in Western clothes, which for a sannyasi was considered not possible. And also to travel in modern vehicles. And we know Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj also did it himself for preaching. But we should also understand that he would only do it for preaching. When it came to his personal life, he was very simple, very detached. And we know he also made certain exceptions in many times. There's quite a few stories like this, where for preaching, he would break a lesser principle, or often himself not, but he would tell his disciples to break a lesser principles to preach. So he understood that the most important thing was to give Krishna to people. And whatever stands in the way, even if it is a principle, then this is not actually the right mood of the devotee. But he rarely broke principles, lesser principles, so he always wanted his disciples to follow this principle. So one example is like on Ekadashi, and he found out that many of the disciples were following strict no food, no water in the mat, and he became very unhappy because obviously he was expecting his brahmachari sannyasis to go out. That was the whole purpose. So he told them they have to go out, and if you have to eat, then eat. But the purpose was not that you eat, no, you don't eat, but if you have to eat to preach, then you do it. So this was the mood of Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, and Prabhupada very much took that same mood, and there are many stories of Prabhupada also making certain adjustments for the benefit of humanity. And actually one amazing thing which I didn't know is I thought Prabhupada was the first one to establish a brahmacharini ashram, but Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati actually also, he actually understood that at the time, things weren't ideal in terms of society, and a lot of ladies actually were struggling to practice Krishna consciousness in situations where they were supported by family members, either their husbands or their children. So many of them were left, abandoned or had no shelter, and it was very difficult to be practicing. So he actually established, or wanted to establish, a Vishnu Priya ashram. And ultimately, his concern was that they find a place of refuge where they can practice, to give them an opportunity, to make advancement in spiritual life, like everyone should, no matter in any situation. So yes, it's amazing that not only Prabhupada finally established it, but Bhaktisiddhanta had already started establishing that. And ultimately, the greatest gift that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj gave to us was actually Srila Prabhupada. So it is by the grace of Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj that Prabhupada was actually able to do what he did. Prabhupada, most of the times he mentioned his spiritual master, he was always mentioning him in this mood, that I'm so unqualified, and the only thing I'm able to do, or the only qualification I have, is that I'm following the instructions of my spiritual master. And so we see that the desire of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, desire of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, ultimately fructified completely with Srila Prabhupada. But that doesn't mean that they weren't as important as Prabhupada. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is a great family, and ultimately it's all a team effort. And all of this was done together. And all of this was done in the right time and place and sequence. So I was actually meditating on this yesterday, and it somehow or other I got this very nice idea of how to understand their positions. That we know that there's a verse in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and I think is the second verse, Vandeyam Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sahodito Godadai Pushvanto Nitya Sando Tamo Nudo, and that Sri Chaitanya and Nityananda are just like the sun and the moon who have arisen simultaneously on the horizon of Gauda and are dissipating the darkness born of ignorance and giving benediction, mercifully giving benedictions upon all. So yeah, if Chaitanya Mahaprabhu are like the sun and the moon, then ultimately life can only exist by the sun and the moon. You know, we speak about, if you look at this world, we look at life, but without the sun and the moon, there would be no life. So ultimately, a life is only possible by the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda Prabhu. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur obviously re-established the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So for my understanding, or my little concept of this was meditation, was think Bhaktivinoda Thakur was like the fertile earth and the seed. So he planted the seed, he started re-establishing, he put the literatures as they were, he made everything in the way that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had brought Krishna consciousness to this world, and he laid the foundations. And then Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj obviously watered that seed, and out of that seed grew a beautiful tree, and obviously that became the preaching mission. So the form of the mission was really there, established from the fertile earth and that seed. And that tree was obviously there and very strong, but one tree was not enough. But from that tree, Srila Prabhupada actually took the fruits and took the seeds and actually spread it all over the world. So we can see how actually this is a wonderful sequence, how you cannot say that, compare the acharyas and say that one did more, one did less, that ultimately everything was possible by the mercy of the Lord, and everyone had their role to play, and everyone perfectly continued the mission of the Lord. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing that through their mercy of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, and ultimately Srila Prabhupada, and of course all the previous acharyas we haven't mentioned, that we are able to receive this greatest gift of Krishna consciousness, which we shouldn't take for granted, which very few living entities in this material world have the opportunity to take. And I try and remind this to myself every day, and hopefully devotees can also remind this to me every day. And I'm sure by studying Prabhupada's books, the more and more I can live by that and remember that there's only one real meaning to life, is ultimately to serve Krishna. And by pleasing the Vaishnavas, serving the Vaishnavas, only then we'll be able to actually serve and please Krishna. So yes, I would like to thank all the devotees for tolerating me here today. And please, if there's anything that you can take from this class that can be of benefit to you, then please do. And whatever I said that wasn't beneficial, that have been misplaced or missaid, then please forgive me for it. And yes, I can only glorify Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj and Prabhupada for some other giving me this opportunity, so thank you. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura Maharaj ki Jai. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. I don't know if we have time for any comments or any realizations or things.